A Mouse's Atlantic Crossing, 1902. This episode follows one very small traveler on one very large journey. In 1902, a mouse living among the ropes and grain sacks of a European harbour finds itself carried, without any plan of its own, into the sealed world of a steamship bound for New York. From a dockside warehouse to the crowded decks of steerage, through a mid-ocean storm that nearly costs it its hiding place, and finally into the noise and hope of New York Harbour, this is a story of an ocean crossing seen from somewhere near the floor. It ends quietly in a new home on a new continent. If this small stowaway's view of a great crossing feels like your kind of place, leave a comment with the hiding spot you think you'd choose aboard an old ship, and consider liking or subscribing for more restful stories. Now, let's step down into the warehouse where this particular journey begins. Before it ever saw a ship, the mouse knew the harbour the way a person might know a familiar street, by smell, by sound, and by the small daily rhythms of the creatures who worked there. Its world was a warehouse near the docks, a place of stacked grain sacks, coiled rope, and timbers gone soft and grey with damp. Mornings arrived first as light through cracks in the boards, then as noise, cartwheels on stone, the scrape of crates, men's voices rising and falling in the unhurried business of a working quay. By 1902, harbours like this one were used to a particular kind of morning traffic, families and their belongings moving from lodging houses toward the waiting hulls of steamships bound for America. Baggage was not an afterthought in this world. Passenger records from the period regularly counted trunks and parcels as carefully as they counted people, because for an emigrant family, luggage was not simply luggage. It was bedding, spare clothing, tools, sometimes food carried from home, all of it pressed into whatever space a steamship company's rules allowed. Steerage contracts of the era often measured a family's allowance in cubic feet rather than in number of pieces, which meant packing was an exercise in compression. Soft bundles pressed into corners, blankets rolled tight, tins and jars wedged between folded coats. For a mouse, a well-packed trunk was not so different from a well-stocked cellar. The same smells that drew it through the warehouse, grain, leather, tallow, the faint sweetness of dried fruit, also clung to the baggage of families preparing to leave. On the morning this particular journey began, the mouse was doing what it always did, following scent along the safest low routes, beneath planks, behind stacked sacks, into the shadow of anything large enough to hide a small body from careless boots. Nearby, in a modest room above a shop that took in lodgers before sailing days, a family was finishing the same task thousands of families performed in those years, turning a life into parcels. A mother folded linens into a trunk already crowded with clothing. An older child tied a bundle of outer coats with twine, while a smaller one sat wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, half asleep on a heap of folded bedding. This is not a scene drawn from any single documented voyage. It is the kind of ordinary morning that many such families experienced, reconstructed here to make sense of what came next. Loose cloth, folded quickly and stacked in haste, left small gaps and hollows, exactly the sort of space a mouse might use without anyone noticing, especially in a room full of half-finished packing and tired attention. At some point in that late morning light, as bundles were gathered and trunks were closed, the mouse slipped beneath a fold of cloth destined for the ship. It is impossible to know, and this account does not claim to know, precisely which piece of baggage carried it, or which family's hands last touched the bundle before it left the room. What can be said with more confidence is that the conditions were exactly the kind in which such a thing could happen unnoticed. Crowded belongings, hurried final packing, and a mouse already accustomed to treating soft baggage as another kind of shelter. By early afternoon, the household's trunks and bundles had joined the general traffic moving toward the harbour. Personal accounts from emigrants sailing in this period describe exactly this kind of midday departure. Baggage and passengers converging on the docks together, porters and dockhands moving quickly to load a ship preparing to sail on schedule. Inspection of steerage baggage did happen on some routes, mainly to catch spoiled food rather than to search for stowaways of any kind, animal or otherwise. A mouse folded deep inside a bundle of clothing, motionless and small, was simply not the kind of thing anyone was looking for. On the loading deck, the ordinary chaos of embarkation was already in motion. Porters hoisted trunks by rope and shoulder, calling to one another over the clatter of iron-bound corners against the gangway. Sacks of provisions for the voyage went up alongside the passengers' own belongings, indistinguishable in that rush from crates meant for the ship's stores. Somewhere in that stream of baggage, one bundle of folded cloth, carrying unnoticed its small passenger, was lifted from the quay, swung briefly over open water, and set down inside the ship's hold or storage space, no longer resting on the solid stone of the dock. For the mouse, this transition felt at first like nothing more than being moved to a new shelf in a familiar kind of place, dark, close, layered with the smells of other people's belongings. It had been moved before, from one warehouse corner to another, from beneath one stack of sacks to beneath the next. What it could not yet know was that the floor beneath this new hiding place was no longer connected to the ground at all. The wood and rope and cloth around it, the very things that felt like an ordinary cellar, were already suspended above open water, waiting for the ship's engines to carry them away from shore. It took no dramatic moment for the mouse to reach this new world. There was no single instant of discovery, no clear line between warehouse and voyage. There was only baggage, handled quickly and without much scrutiny, moving from one resting place to another in the ordinary rush of a departure day. And that, more than any single dramatic act, is how a small creature accustomed to dockside life could end up sealed inside the traveling world of a steamship without a single person ever knowing it was there. By the time the light through the cracks in its hiding place began to change, growing dimmer and stranger than any warehouse afternoon, the mouse had already drawn its small, mistaken conclusion. This was simply another cellar, another quiet corner among sacks and crates, no different from 100 others it had known. It could not yet feel the first faint tremor building somewhere deep in the ship's hull, the sound of ropes being drawn in, or the widening gap of water beginning to open between the vessel and the solid stones of the quay. That understanding would come soon enough, in the shifting, engine-driven world waiting just beyond this first quiet hiding place. The mouse had tucked itself among sacks and crates, certain it had found nothing more than another warehouse corner, its earlier hiding place undisturbed by anything except distant footsteps and the smell of tar. It did not yet know that the floor beneath it belonged to something that intended to move, or that the faint tremor building deep in the hull was the first sign of a change no cellar back home could have prepared it for. The tremor grew steadier as the afternoon light thinned, rising through the timber like a drumbeat that refused to stop. Above, thick mooring ropes were being hauled in, coiled and stacked by crewmen working with practiced speed. Passengers gathered along the upper rail to watch the harbour begin to recede, and the mouse, pressed near a heap of rope not far from where the sailors laboured, felt the shift in the world before it understood any reason for it. The stones of the quay, solid only hours before, seemed to slide backward, though it was the ship, not the shore, doing the moving. Small tugboats pushed and nudged the hull until the vessel found its own line, and a long whistle sounded overhead, low enough to hum in the mouse's narrow chest. For the passengers themselves, that same hour likely carried a tangle of relief and worry that had been building long before the ropes were ever loosed. Boarding a transatlantic steamer in 1902 was rarely a single tidy motion. Trunks and bundles were often carried aboard in stages through the middle of the day, passengers moving past officials and checkpoints while surrounded by voices in languages they did not share, and the ship itself did not always pull away until hours after the first bags had been stowed. One traveller's account from a 1902 crossing describes fellow passengers as already worn thin from noise and vibration before they had even set foot on the gangway, which suggests that the sensation of overwhelming motion did not begin with departure so much as continue from the disorder that came before it. If that was true for people who understood, at least broadly, what a ship was, it must have been far stranger for a creature with no context for any of it beyond the evidence of its own senses. Exploring cautiously once the harbour noise faded into open water, the mouse discovered that this new shelter was nothing like the flat, familiar floors of a dockside warehouse. A narrow stairway led it away from the rail and down into a passage where the light dimmed and the air thickened with coal smoke and the press of many bodies. Bunks rose in tiers along the walls, strung with rope netting, and to the mouse's low vantage, this arrangement looked almost impossible, a world stacked upward instead of spread flat, held together by wooden frames rather than steady crates. Families near the evening meal were tucking bundles beneath the bunks and coaxing children into corners, speaking in the particular hush that follows a long day of waiting. The mouse slipped between shoes and baggage, learning along the way that the pipes running the length of the corridor carried both warmth and vibration, a pulse it would come to recognize many times before the voyage ended. At every turn, the ship revealed itself as something built in layers rather than laid out flat, a shape no warehouse cellar had ever taught the mouse to expect. Ladders connected one level to the next, corridors bent without warning, and sound behaved strangely, arriving from directions that made little sense until one understood that a shout from an upper deck could roll down through an open hatch into steerage itself. At intervals, announcements drifted through the passageways in brisk, unfamiliar tones, meaningless to the mouse but evidently understood, at least in part, by passengers who paused mid-step to listen. Conditions and routines like these were not uniform across every line or vessel of the period, so this pattern of movement and message is best understood as a plausible reconstruction rather than a record of one specific 1902 ship. As full evening settled over the passageways, the mouse found itself pulled toward the source of the heaviest vibration, tracking it the way any small animal tracks an unfamiliar scent. It moved along a service corridor, past coiled rope and stacked provisions, drawing closer to the iron core of the vessel. Heat rolled outward from the boiler room even into the surrounding passage, and a fireman crossed briefly into view, shovel in hand, walking with the particular weariness of someone already well into a long shift. The mouse pressed itself flat against a support beam as the engine's rhythm thundered through the metal around it, a steady mechanical heartbeat that would, in time, feel almost as familiar as the old dockside sounds it had left behind. For now, it simply absorbed the sensation, one more strange fact to add to its slowly growing map of the ship. Just how crowded that map would become is difficult to fix precisely, since crowd sizes varied by ship and line, but several vessels of the surrounding years carried several hundred to nearly 1,000 people in third class alone, and even a more modest number would have filled every passage with trunks, blankets, and restless children. First-hand accounts from steerage travellers of the period describe air that grew close and heavy with the mingling of cooking smells, coal smoke, and simple human proximity, conditions severe enough on at least one later voyage to push passengers up toward open air rather than remain below. Whether or not this particular ship reached that same extreme, the crowding alone would have shaped nearly every path the mouse tried to take, forcing it into gaps between boots and bundles as it searched for a way through that felt safe. By the time full dark had closed over the ship, the mouse had gathered enough impressions to sense, without truly understanding, the nature of its new surroundings. The world beneath its feet was no longer one unmoving floor, but a structure built in tiers, each level humming with its own noise, its own smell, and its own particular rhythm of coming and going. Passengers who had boarded anxious and half-lost were beginning to find corners of their own, murmuring to children or steadying themselves against the ship's first real roll as it met open water beyond the harbour mouth. The mouse, too, searched for a place to wait out the night, though real rest came only in short bursts, interrupted again and again by the engine's pulse and the slow creak of a hull learning to carry its passengers across open sea. There was still far more of this vertical world left to discover than the mouse had yet crossed. More ladders, more corridors, more crowded corners it could only guess at from the noises drifting past. But one plain fact had already settled into its small understanding. Nothing beneath its feet intended to stay still for long. With that uneasy realization sitting alongside its curiosity, the mouse turned toward the deeper maze of bunks and baggage still waiting just ahead, where hundreds of strangers were already making a temporary home of their own. The mouse had turned toward the deeper maze of bunks and baggage, and now, with the engines humming steadily somewhere below the boards, it began to learn just how many strangers had been folded into this floating neighborhood. The passage from the crates led into a long, low room lined with narrow wooden frames stacked 2 and sometimes 3 high, each one barely wider than a grown person's shoulders. This was steerage, as many ships of the period arranged it, and though details differed from line to line, one thing seems to have held true across a number of 1902 crossings. Passengers were not simply left to shift for themselves. On at least one shipping line's own records from that year, each traveller was issued a mattress, bedding, and a small set of eating utensils upon boarding. Whether every vessel matched this arrangement exactly is impossible to know, but it suggests steerage functioned as a managed system rather than an unregulated scramble, and the Mouse's first full morning below decks bore this out in its own small way. Above one of the lower bunks ran a beam just wide enough for careful footing, and the Mouse used it to travel the length of the room without touching the crowded floor below. There, a mother worked to smooth a rough blanket over a mattress that had clearly seen other journeys before this one, tucking its edges with practiced motions that suggested she had packed bedding many times before, perhaps for shorter trips within her own country. 2 children knelt nearby, folding a second blanket into thirds, while an older woman, likely a grandmother or an aunt traveling with the family, arranged a small stack of clothing into the driest corner of the bunk frame. The Mouse recognized the trunk beside them from the previous night, the same trunk whose seams had first let it aboard, and this small recognition gave the beam above their heads a different weight than the other beams stretching off into the dim length of the room. Married couples, single women, and single men were commonly berthed in separate sections of steerage on ships of this period, a practical arrangement meant to preserve some order in tightly packed quarters. The family below the Mouse occupied a corner clearly set aside for parents and children together, close enough to other family groups that voices in more than one language drifted across the narrow aisle between bunks. The Mouse could not follow any of the words, but it began sorting which voice belonged to which shape, which cough came from the man 2 bunks over, which laugh belonged to the smaller of the 2 children. This was not affection yet, only the beginning of a map, much like the one it had once kept of grain sacks and rope coils back in the warehouse, except that this map moved with the sea. By midday, activity shifted toward a cramped space near the end of the corridor, where several basins sat fixed along a low wooden shelf. Washing arrangements varied considerably between ships and lines in this period, and no single description can stand for all of them. But a fixed washing area of this kind, however limited, appears often enough in surviving accounts to suggest it was a common feature. The Mouse followed the family as far as it dared, keeping to the shadow where wall met ceiling, and watched passengers take turns rinsing hands and faces in water that had plainly been used more than once already that morning. Damp boards lined the floor beneath the basins, and someone had strung a length of cord overhead where a few shirts and a child's stockings hung dripping, swaying with the ship's motion as though keeping time with the engines somewhere below. The washroom emptied and filled in waves through the day, one family withdrawing as another arrived, and the Mouse noticed that this rhythm repeated itself with something close to the regularity of the engine's own pulse. Meals followed a similar pattern. On many steamships of this era, food was served 3 times daily at set hours, with stewards moving between long tables to distribute portions and later collect the utensils, a routine that turned steerage from a shapeless crowd into something closer to a working schedule. The family the Mouse had come to know took their meals at one of these tables whenever the call sounded, though they also kept something apart from the ship's own provisions, something wrapped carefully in cloth and tucked beneath a fold of blanket in their corner of the bunk space. That evening, As the lamps along the corridor dimmed to their lower nighttime setting, the mouse watched the older woman unwrap this parcel with careful hands. Inside lay a dense, round loaf, likely carried from home, along with a twist of dried fruit and a small cloth bundle whose contents the mouse could not identify from its place along the beam. Bread brought from a family's own kitchen would have meant something beyond simple nourishment on a voyage such as this, a thread tying the ship's rented world of mess tins and steward-served portions back to whatever kitchen and village had been left behind. And it is not hard to imagine why such food was kept close and watched rather than left loose among the general baggage. The children ate their share slowly, clearly savoring it, while the mother wrapped what remained and returned it beneath the blanket fold, resting a hand on the bundle once as if to check it was still there. Drawn by the smell of that bread, the mouse edged along the beam until it reached a point almost directly above the family's stacked baggage, close enough now that a stray crumb near the trunk's base felt almost like an invitation. It did not come down yet, but it lingered there longer than it had lingered anywhere since boarding, watching the family arrange themselves for the night with the particular economy of movement that comes from having done the same thing the evening before. The older woman drew her shawl over her shoulders, the children pressed into the narrow space beside their mother, and the trunk, holding both belongings and bread, became for the mouse the fixed point around which the rest of this crowded, unfamiliar ship began to take shape. It had found, in this one corner of borrowed bunks and shared baggage, its first reliable map of the voyage, a map built not from stone walls and grain sacks, but from blankets, trunk seams, and the particular sound of one family settling into sleep. This corner would not stay perfectly still, and the mouse could not yet know how quickly hunger and curiosity would carry it further. But for now, it had a place to return to, and that alone made the ship feel slightly less like an ocean and slightly more like a home it was still learning. Already, though, a new scent had begun drifting up through the corridor from somewhere deeper in the vessel, warm and unfamiliar, pulling the mouse's attention toward the pots and fires of the galley waiting below. The new scent had already begun pulling at the mouse before it understood what it meant, drifting up through the corridor from somewhere deeper in the vessel, warm and thick with things it had never smelled together before. It followed the smell the way it followed most things aboard the ship, by instinct rather than plan, moving low along a wall worn pale by hundreds of passing feet. The corridor narrowed, then opened into a strip of light and noise unlike anywhere it had explored so far, brighter, hotter, and beating with a rhythm it had not yet learned to predict. This was the galley, though the mouse had no name for it. What it understood instead was heat pressing outward through an open doorway, steam rolling into the passage like a slow grey animal, and the shape of a man moving through that doorway carrying something heavy and covered. Surviving accounts of steerage-era voyages describe exactly this kind of threshold moment, a cook or steward stepping from the working heart of the ship into the passenger world beyond it, and the mouse had stumbled into a small version of that same daily crossing without knowing what it meant. It only knew that when the steam rolled out, other smells came with it: boiled meat, browned bread, something sharp like onion, and beneath all of it the steady breath of coal being fed somewhere below to keep the whole apparatus running. For passengers crossing the Atlantic in 1902, meals were rarely a private matter conducted at one's own pace. By most surviving descriptions, they were a managed event, governed by a bell, a line, and an order of who came first. The mouse could not have understood the schedule shaping the humans around it, but it could feel the corridor's rhythm change as mealtime approached. Feet moved faster, voices rose. Children who had been half asleep against trunks straightened suddenly, tin cups gripped in their hands like small trophies. Repeated often enough, this shift became something the mouse noticed before it understood, the way an animal senses weather before rain arrives. Evidence from ships of this period, including surviving menus and government accounts of steerage service, suggests a food routine both plain and dependable. 2 main meals a day for many low-fare travelers, coffee or tea with bread in the morning, and a heartier combination of soup, meat or fish, bread, and potatoes at the day's larger meal, with dessert rare enough to be remembered when it appeared. It was not a varied diet, but it was steady, and steadiness may have meant something to people whose whole circumstances had been upended by the voyage. On many ships, passengers ate together at long tables below deck, and stewards distributed food from large tin pans, portioning out what would then be eaten with cups, plates, and utensils passengers were expected to wash themselves afterward. This particular vessel's exact system cannot be confirmed, but the general shape of shared trays, tin implements, and communal washing fits well with what many steerage travelers of the era experienced. The mouse, of course, understood none of this as policy. It understood crumbs. It understood the specific charged moment when the serving line began to move, when families gathered near a doorway holding empty cups and reaching for what stewards passed toward them, and when, for a short window afterward, the corridor floor scattered with dropped bread, spilled broth, and the occasional overlooked scrap within reach of a small scavenger. The mouse had already learned which hours brought this bounty, and which brought only footsteps and closed doors. Without quite realizing it, it had begun shaping its days around the ship's eating schedule, rather than around daylight, which barely reached these lower passages at all. One family gave the mouse a clearer sense of this rhythm than any other, the same family whose baggage had carried it aboard without their knowledge. At each mealtime, one of the children, usually the older of the two, was sent forward with cups and a small tin toward the serving line, weaving between adults with the seriousness of someone entrusted with an important task. The mouse would sometimes trail partway behind, staying low against the wall, watching small hands accept a portion of something warm and carry it back with visible concentration, careful not to spill what had been given. This is not a documented incident from any specific ship's records, but a reasonable reconstruction of the kind of small duty many accounts suggest fell to steerage children, made necessary by the scale of feeding so many passengers with a limited crew. After the meal came a second layer of smell, softer than the food itself, wet wool drying in the crowded warmth of the room, mixed with the plain soap some passengers used to scrub tin cups before returning them to shelves or bundles. Beneath both lingered the steady undertone of coal smoke drifting down from wherever the ship's fires burned, and beneath that, faintly, the mineral breath of the sea slipping in through some distant grating. None of it made for a pleasant single scent, but together it formed something the mouse had begun, in its own limited way, to rely upon. When the smells arrived, the day had a shape. When they faded, evening had come. By the time the child carried an empty cup back toward the family's corner of baggage, the corridor had dimmed into its familiar in-between hours, neither mealtime nor rest. The cup found its place on a narrow shelf beside a folded blanket, and the mouse followed the same path it always used now, tracing footsteps and faint crumb trails back to the space beside the trunks, its hiding spot growing a little more familiar with each repetition. The ship's food had become a second clock ticking beneath the more distant and uncertain clock of daylight, one the mouse could feel and trust in a way it could not yet trust the ocean itself. It did not yet know how soon that trust would be tested, or how quickly the calm rhythm of meals and corridors could be swallowed by something far less predictable stirring in the sea outside. The calm rhythm of meals and corridors had begun to feel like the true shape of life aboard, the one steady thing the mouse could trust when everything else moved. That trust was about to be tested by something no smell from the galley could warn against, a change in the sea itself, gathering somewhere beyond the hull long before anyone below decks could name it. The first sign was in the light. A grey afternoon deepened faster than it should have, and the corridor windows, small and salt-streaked as they were, dimmed until the lanterns had to be lit earlier than usual. Footsteps overhead grew quicker and more purposeful, crew moving with the particular urgency of people closing things that were meant to stay open. On many transatlantic steamers of the period, rough weather meant sealing the hatches that connected steerage to the open deck, a practical measure to keep water out that also meant less air moving through the lower decks at exactly the moment when more people were confined there. The mouse felt this shift as pressure rather than reasoning, a thickening of the air, a stillness in the ventilation that had carried cooking smells and voices for days without much change. Passengers who had been drifting toward the deck for a breath of open sky turned back instead, funneled into the same crowded rooms they had only recently escaped. The family the mouse had come to know moved with the same instinct, gathering children and small bundles closer, speaking in the low, clipped tones people use when they are choosing not to sound worried. Nobody aboard needed an announcement to understand that the ship's mood had changed. The mouse, tucked near a shelf of tin cups it had grown fond of, felt the first real roll beneath its feet, a long tilt that emptied itself out slowly instead of correcting at once. Through the evening, the motion built in a way that made the earlier pitching of ordinary days feel almost gentle by comparison. Some accounts from steerage passengers on rough Atlantic crossings around this time describe water coming over the deck, hatches battened down in response, and sand scattered across wet boards so that people would not slip while trying to move between bunks and washing areas. Whether this particular ship used sand or some other trick of its crew is not something the mouse could have known or reported, but the general shape of the trouble was the same: wet, unstable footing, and a below-decks world working hard to keep people upright. It was in this thickened, unsettled air that the baggage space began to shift. The mouse had grown used to its favorite ledge above the trunks, a dry, shadowed perch where cloth and rope made a soft border against the world. As the ship heeled harder to one side, holding the tilt a beat longer than usual before slowly rolling back, a stack of trunks nearby groaned and slid, one edge catching against another with a sound like a door dragged over stone. A bundle of bedding, loosely tied and wedged above the trunks, slipped free and fell in a heavy, muffled heap, scattering across the floor where the mouse's legs had been only moments before. There was no time for anything but movement. The mouse scrambled higher, claws finding purchase on a strip of exposed wood as the whole stack resettled with another roll of the hull, the world briefly sideways before gravity reasserted itself and pulled everything back toward the floor. It is worth saying plainly that this was not the ship breaking apart or the crossing turning into disaster. It was ordinary cargo doing what cargo does in a hard sea, moving because nothing had bound it tightly enough against a roll no one had quite expected. Some crossings that same year were rougher still. In at least one documented case from a transatlantic steamer of the period, a storm was severe enough that the ship rolled through a wide, dramatic arc and had to stop making headway entirely for many hours, riding out the worst of it rather than fighting forward. In that same recorded storm, baggage stored in an upper steerage compartment was thrown into such disorder that its contents became an unrecognizable tangle, and the shifting mass struck an exhaust pipe running through the space, breaking it and letting engine exhaust seep into the compartment. There is no way to know whether the ship carrying the mouse endured anything approaching that severity, and it would be unfair to the family below decks to assume the worst, simply because such a case exists on record. But the pattern it reveals is useful all the same. In a hard enough sea, ordinary stowed weight could move with real force, and pipes running through those hidden spaces were not immune to the consequences. For the mouse, the immediate problem was smaller and more personal than any legal record could capture. Its familiar ledge was buried under fallen bedding, and the route it usually took toward the warmer corridors near the galley was blocked by a trunk that had wedged itself sideways against a support beam. It had to find another way, and it did what it had done since the docks. It followed the shapes of the ship itself, tracing pipes and beams by touch and smell rather than sight. The metal ran warm in places from machinery working somewhere below, and cooler in others where it passed through spaces open to the damp air, seeping in around sealed hatches. Threading along this hidden skeleton of the vessel, the mouse moved through narrow gaps between bulkheads, past coils of rope stored for reasons it could not guess, and along ledges too thin for anything larger than itself. Around it, the human world was making its own adjustments. Passengers held onto bunk frames and to each other, riding out the worst of the rolling with the particular patience of people who had already decided, days ago, that this crossing would demand endurance rather than comfort. Some were sick again, the motion undoing whatever calm their stomachs had found. Children were held closer, not out of drama, but simple caution, arms wrapped around them the way one might steady anything precious during a jolt. The family whose baggage had first carried the mouse aboard weathered the rough hours in much the same way as their neighbors, gripping their belongings and each other, waiting for the ship to settle into a rhythm less likely to throw them from their bunks. That settling did come, gradually, the way most storms at sea do rather than all at once. The wind did not vanish, and the ship did not stop rolling entirely, but the sharpest, most sudden lurches began to space themselves further apart until the motion felt less like a series of shocks and more like one long, tired sway. Crew moved through the corridors, checking on stowed baggage and offering brief reassurances in whatever languages they had between them. And slowly the passengers who had braced themselves against bunk posts began to loosen their grips. Later that night, once the worst of the rolling had eased, the mouse found a new resting place in a narrow gap behind a run of pipes, close enough to their warmth to stay dry, hidden from the traffic of feet and boots that still moved cautiously through the corridor. Folded cloth, shifted there by the same disorder that had displaced its old ledge, made a soft enough barrier against the metal, and the vibration of the engines returned as something almost comforting after hours of unpredictable motion. The family, not far off, had reclaimed their usual places as well, murmuring quietly to one another in the dark, tired but unharmed. The ship, for all its groaning and tilting, had not lost its order so much as bent it briefly, the way anything built to cross an ocean must be able to do. By morning, the sea had not fully forgiven its temper, but it had loosened its grip enough for ordinary movement to resume below decks, hatches easing open again to let stale air trade places with the cold, salted kind from outside. The mouse, settled into its new pipe-side shelter, could not know how many more days of open water lay ahead before land returned to change the rhythm all over again. The storm had loosened its grip by morning, and the mouse, tucked into its new shelter beside the warm pipe, had no way of knowing how many mornings just like it still waited ahead. The ship rolled less now, its motion settling into something almost familiar, and the air below decks slowly traded its damp, closed smell for the ordinary mix of coal smoke, boiled food, and human breath the mouse had already come to know. What followed was not another crisis, but something harder to name, a long, featureless stretch of days in which the ship simply continued and continued, with no shore in sight to mark its progress. For the mouse, time at sea had never meant much beyond hunger and light, but it began to notice that the humans measured it differently now too. There were no landmarks to point to, no trees or rooftops sliding past a window, only the same grey or blue water stretching in every direction. Meals came and went, bells rang from unseen places, and voices called out announcements the mouse could not understand but had learned to recognize by their rhythm. The days stopped feeling like separate events and folded instead into one long unfolding sameness, broken only by the small rituals people built for themselves to keep the hours from blurring entirely. On clearer mornings, when the sea lay calm and the sun found gaps in the deck rigging, passengers came up in greater numbers than before. The mouse, drawn by the light and by simple curiosity, found a favorite perch inside a loosely coiled length of rope near the rail, where it could watch without being seen. From there the ocean looked endless in every direction, a flat horizon broken by nothing at all, and even the humans who leaned against the rail seemed to search that emptiness for something that was clearly not there yet. Their stillness looked different from fear. It looked more like waiting that had slowly learned to make peace with itself, the kind of patience that comes only after there is nothing left to do but continue. Fewer people held their stomachs now, and fewer faces carried the pale, damp look the mouse remembered from the first days after departure. Seasickness had not vanished, but it had eased into something closer to discomfort than emergency, and passengers who had barely left their bunks earlier in the voyage began appearing at meals with steadier steps and clearer voices. Travel accounts from crossings of this kind describe exactly that shift, monotony replacing crisis, ordinary discomfort replacing dramatic suffering, as the body slowly adjusted to a floor that never stopped moving beneath it. The mouse could not have explained this the way a person might, but it understood the change well enough through smell and sound alone, sensing less illness in the air and more footsteps moving with purpose instead of caution. By afternoon, a new kind of activity often filled the sheltered stretches of deck, one the mouse found endlessly interesting to watch. Women and older children strung damp clothing along makeshift lines wherever the wind and spray allowed, shirts and small dresses lifting and twisting in the salt air like pale, shapeless birds caught mid-flight. The mouse crept along the base of a coiled rope to follow the motion of cloth, fascinated by movement that came from wind rather than any engine. It was a small, unremarkable chore repeated across the deck day after day, yet it gave each afternoon a shape, a task begun and finished, a result you could see drying by evening. For people whose whole world had shrunk to a few decks and corridors, even laundry became a quiet way of proving that a day had actually passed. Meals continued to anchor the hours more reliably than anything else aboard. The clang of a bell, the call of a steward, the shuffle of feet moving toward the same worn corridor at roughly the same time each day gave the ship's crowded population a shared, almost domestic pulse. Children who had spent the storm clinging to their bunks now ran small races along open patches of deck when the weather allowed, or played counting games with buttons and bits of string, their laughter carrying oddly far across open water. The mouse watched these games from door frames and shadowed corners, learning the particular restless energy of boredom finally breaking loose in young bodies that had been cooped up far too long below decks. Adults filled the hours differently, though just as habitually as the children did. Card games appeared in corners of the common areas, along with mending, small arguments over small matters, and long conversations that seemed to circle the same familiar worries about work, weather, and the family left behind across the water. Announcements crackled through now and then, calling attention to meal times, drills, or plain notices about weather ahead, and passengers had grown practiced at half-listening while continuing whatever task already had their hands. None of it resembled excitement. It resembled the ordinary friction of shared life, the kind that develops naturally once strangers have been folded into the same narrow spaces for long enough to stop feeling like strangers. As daylight faded, a different rhythm often settled over the lower decks and their crowded corners. In sheltered spots, small groups gathered to talk in low voices, and sometimes prayers or unhurried hymns rose above the gentle murmur of the ship's engines. The mouse, keeping to the shadow beneath a wooden bench, noticed how children leaned instinctively toward their parents at these moments, sensing without words that this part of the evening asked for stillness rather than play. Accounts of steerage life from this era describe evenings shaped much this way, with prayer, singing, and slow conversation forming a kind of communal punctuation to otherwise shapeless days. The exact words spoken aboard this particular ship cannot be known, but the pattern fits comfortably within what such crossings are understood to have looked like. Watching all of this from beneath benches, behind trunks, and inside the shadow of coiled rope, the mouse began to form its own understanding of what these days without land really were. They were not empty, even though the horizon offered nothing but water in every direction, morning after morning. They were filled instead with small, repeated acts, meals eaten at the same hours, clothes hung and gathered, games invented and reinvented, prayers or stories exchanged as the light dropped low over the water. The ship had no scenery to offer its passengers, so its passengers built their own scenery out of habit, turning corridors and open decks into something closer to a neighborhood than a vessel crossing an empty ocean. It struck the mouse in its own small way that comfort did not require a view. It only seemed to require rhythm, something to expect and something to finish over and over until enough of those completions added up to a feeling almost like home. The family whose baggage had first carried the mouse aboard settled into this same rhythm as everyone else around them, their voices growing less anxious, their movements more familiar, their evenings quieter in the way that comes from simple exhaustion rather than lingering fear. The mouse, drawn again and again toward their corner of the bunks, had begun to feel less like an accidental passenger and more like a small, unnoticed member of their temporary household. It could not know how many days of open water still separated them from land, only that each one passed in roughly the same fashion as the last, folded neatly into meals, chores, and the murmur of nearby voices. That sameness, however, was about to be interrupted, not by weather this time, but by the sudden, whiskered presence of other small creatures drawn toward the very same crumbs, corners, and warmth the mouse had quietly claimed as its own. The whiskered strangers near the mouse's pipe-side shelter turned out to be nothing more alarming than distant cousins of its own kind, drawn by the same crumbs and the same warmth, and within a few nights of wary sniffing, the ship simply proved large enough to hold them all without much trouble. The mouse kept to its own paths rather than share them, and soon the small excitement faded back into the familiar rhythm of shipboard life. What replaced it was harder to name. The engines still beat their steady pulse through the floorboards, and the air below decks smelled the same as it had for days, yet something in the way people moved had begun to change, as though the whole vessel were leaning toward an idea rather than a place. The mouse noticed it first in the mornings. Passengers who had spent most of the crossing folding themselves back into rumpled blankets without much thought now shook those blankets out fully, smoothing them flat and folding them into tighter, neater squares. Coats that had hung damp on hooks for weeks were taken down and brushed, sleeves turned inside out, collars checked and sometimes mended with a few careful stitches by hands clearly practiced in such work. Parcels once tied loosely for convenience were retied with more purpose, corners squared, string doubled where it looked ready to fray. None of this happened all at once, and no single announcement seemed to start it. It simply built, day after day, until the crowded compartment looked less like a place people were enduring and more like one they were preparing to leave. No passenger list or shipping ledger could describe this shift in exact terms, since no two families packed or mended in quite the same way, but the pattern fits comfortably with what is known about the final days of a steerage crossing. Arrival in New York in 1902 did not mean stepping straight from gangplank to street. More waiting and more inspection still lay ahead before any door truly opened onto American ground. Even so, the instinct to look presentable before that waiting began seems to have mattered a great deal, which makes the growing tidiness of these last days easy enough to imagine, whether or not any official eye was yet near enough to notice. The family the mouse had followed since the crowded early days of the voyage joined in this shift like everyone around them. The mother, her apron softened and grayed by weeks of constant use, spent an evening drawing a needle through a torn hem while her children slept nearby, their faces turned to the wall in poses the mouse had learned to recognize without needing to see them clearly. The father tested the trunk's latches more than once, pressing each one firmly as though daring it to fail him now, after carrying his family's belongings safely this far. The mouse, moving along its narrow route behind the boards, felt no fear from any of them anymore, only a low current of hope that seemed to rise from every bunk in the room at once. That hope sharpened one morning when the ship's motion changed in a way even a small set of claws pressed to the deck could feel. The engines slowed, loosening from their long, steady drive into something more careful and deliberate, and passengers who had learned to read such signals began climbing toward open air with unusual purpose. Word passed from bunk to bunk in half a dozen languages the mouse could not understand, though the excitement in the voices needed no translation. Following a draft of moving air toward a gap near the stairs, the mouse crept close enough to glimpse grey water and thicker mist than usual, and somewhere out in that haze, a smaller boat had drawn alongside the ship. This was very likely the harbour pilot coming aboard, a local guide whose task was to steer large vessels safely through New York's crowded and often unfamiliar channels, since captains who had crossed an entire ocean were not always the best judges of a busy port's narrow waterways. Ships nearing the city in this period commonly took on a pilot in just this manner, and sometimes a separate small steamboat flying a plain yellow flag could also appear nearby, a sign that health inspectors might still need to look the vessel over before anyone traveled farther inland. To the mouse, this meant only shapes moving through fog and low voices exchanged across open water. But to the passengers pressed against the rail above, it meant the crossing was, at last, undeniably nearing its end. By the time the light softened into the deep gold of late afternoon, the ship had eased into a slower, steadier pace, and more passengers than the mouse had ever seen at once gathered along the open deck. The family stood among them, their trunk already stacked with others near the rail. The children pressed close to their parents, as though standing that way might somehow bring the shore into view sooner. Tucked into a shadowed gap where a beam met the underside of the deck, the mouse watched their upturned faces catch the fading light and hold it, their stillness unlike the restless waiting of the Voyage's earlier days. Somewhere ahead, past the mist and the moving shapes of other ships, a low gathering of towers and rooftops had begun to take form against the darkening sky, faint enough that some passengers pointed uncertainly before agreeing on what they saw. It was not yet the full and famous skyline later travelers would come to know by heart, only a suggestion of a great and crowded city waiting beyond the water's glare, but it was enough to draw a long, low murmur from the crowd at the rail. The mouse could not know what that shape meant to the people around it, only that their voices had grown warmer and their movements lighter, as if some invisible weight carried since the ship first left its own shore had begun, finally, to lift. Yet the ship did not glide straight into that gathering skyline and finish its journey there. Harbour traffic thickened around it, tugboats and ferries crossing paths in the fading light, and the vessel itself seemed content to ease forward rather than rush toward the docks now so close at hand. Even after reaching New York's waters, a ship carrying steerage passengers in 1902 often still had hours or more of waiting before any true landing, with further transfer and inspection ahead before Ellis Island itself came into the story. The mouse sensed, without understanding why, that arrival would not come all in one motion, that some further stretch of patience still lay between this crowded rail and solid, unmoving ground. For now the deck hummed with hope rather than certainty, and the true stillness the family longed for waited somewhere past the harbour's crowded water, in a corner not yet found. The deck had hummed with hope rather than certainty when the harbour first came into view, and the true stillness the family longed for still waited somewhere past the crowded water, in a corner not yet found. That morning arrived pale and busy, the sky lightening slowly over a forest of masts, smokestacks, and church spires the mouse had no way to name or measure against anything it had known before. Ferries crossed the ship's path in every direction, their whistles overlapping with the deeper calls of tugboats nosing alongside the hull to guide it toward its berth with slow, practiced nudges. Passengers pressed against the rail in coats buttoned for the occasion, murmuring in half a dozen languages at once, and the mouse kept low near the family's trunks, feeling the vibration of the engines change tone as the great vessel eased its speed and began to settle into the harbour's tighter rhythm. The ship did not simply glide up to a city street the way the mouse might once have imagined a harbour working, if it had ever imagined such a thing at all. It came instead to rest against a long pier crowded with other steamers, their hulls almost touching, and here the orderly chaos of the crossing gave way to a different kind of chaos, one governed by officials rather than sailors. Word passed along the deck, in tones the mouse could sense the shape of even without understanding the words themselves, that steerage passengers would not walk straight from the gangway into the city streets waiting just beyond the pier. Ships of this kind, in this era, generally carried their steerage travellers onward by barge to a nearby inspection station, a low cluster of buildings on an island where documents and health were checked before anyone continued further. This part of the journey is fairly well supported by harbour records and photographs from the years just around this one, though the precise experience aboard any single ship still varied with the line, the season, and the mood of the officials on duty that day. Porters and stewards began working the trunks loose from the hold, swinging them down on ropes and onto waiting handcarts with the brisk indifference of men who had done this same work every week for years without much thought to who watched them. The family gathered what they could carry and joined the slow line moving toward the gangway, the mother holding a bundle of blankets against her chest, the father managing the heavier case with both hands, the children clutching smaller parcels tightly against their coats as if letting go might undo the whole crossing. The mouse rode low against the seam of a canvas bag, feeling the gangway's planks bend faintly under so many feet moving together, then felt the world shift again as the crowd stepped down onto a broader, flatter surface that rocked with a far gentler motion than the ship ever had. This was the barge, or something very like it, one of the vessels used at the time to ferry steerage passengers the short distance to the inspection station rather than releasing them straight into Manhattan's streets and crowds. The mouse could not know the name of the place waiting ahead, only that the crowd around it grew denser and quieter as officials in dark uniforms began moving among the arriving families, checking papers and directing lines with brief, economical gestures. Baggage was pulled aside in places, opened, and examined by other officials working separately from the passengers themselves. A detail historical accounts describe fairly consistently, even though exact procedures shifted somewhat from week to week and ship to ship. The family's trunks vanished for a time into this separate current of inspection, leaving the mouse pressed instead into the folds of a coat sleeve, carried rather than transported, trusting the warmth of a familiar body far more than any solid surface beneath its feet. The building they entered next rose high and echoing, filled with the overlapping voices of hundreds of families funneling through narrow rows toward desks and doctors the mouse had no way to understand or even properly see from its low vantage. It is reasonable to imagine long waits, tired children, and the occasional relief of a name called or a paper stamped, though no small creature's account of this process survives anywhere, and these details are offered here as plausible atmosphere rather than as a record of any specific family's actual hours inside that hall. What mattered from the mouse's vantage was simpler and far less procedural. The family moved forward eventually, was reunited with their trunks, and stepped back out into open air with the unmistakable ease of people who had just passed some invisible test they had worried about for weeks. From there, the crossing into the city itself came by boat again, a shorter ferry ride over water grown busier with every passing month of that decade, carrying the family toward piers on the Manhattan side where wagons and streetcars already waited to carry new arrivals further inland. The mouse, tucked back among the baggage now that the inspection had ended, felt the boat's engine hum settle into something almost like the ship's own, though smaller in scale and less patient with the harbor's restless swells. Gulls wheeled overhead, indifferent to newcomers and residents alike, and somewhere beyond the pier, the city itself made its presence known first as sound rather than sight. Cartwheels striking stone, distant shouts, the clatter of loading docks stacked close together along the crowded shoreline. By the time the family reached the narrow building that would hold their first American room, evening had begun to settle over the streets, turning the fading light amber against brick walls the mouse had never seen anything quite like before. The room itself was small, with a single window facing an alley and a floor that did not move at all, a stillness so complete after weeks of engines and swells that the mouse's whiskers seemed to search instinctively for a vibration that no longer existed anywhere nearby. The family set down their trunks with the particular relief of people who have carried the same weight for far too long, and began at once the small rituals of making a room theirs. Blankets unfolded across a narrow bed, a coat hung from a nail near the door, a parcel of bread and cheese set on the single table like a flag planted in unfamiliar ground. The mouse slipped from the folds of the coat sleeve sometime during this unpacking, unnoticed as it had been unnoticed for most of the crossing, and found along the base of the far wall a narrow gap where the plaster had pulled slightly away from the boards behind it. It was an unremarkable space, no different in shape from the warehouse corners and shipboard crevices it had already called home more than once before. Yet it carried something new within it, the faint, lingering smell of salt and coal smoke still clinging to the family's blankets, mixed now with the drier scent of city dust and lamp oil. That mingled smell felt, in its small and unspoken way, less like a wall separating two worlds and more like a bridge quietly joining them. Outside, the sounds of the new city rose and fell in patterns the mouse would need days or weeks to learn, much as it had once needed time to learn the rhythms of meals and footsteps aboard the ship. For tonight, though, none of that needed solving all at once. The mouse tucked itself into the gap behind the baseboard, close enough to hear the family's voices without understanding a single word of them, and let the day's long chain of ferries, halls, and gangways finally fall still around it. Somewhere across the room a lamp was turned low, voices softened into murmurs, and the evening folded itself around the small wall the mouse had chosen, closing the long crossing gently into rest.